GD has a problem, and no, I'm not talking about 2.21. I'm talking about the person who actually making the game, RobTop, aka Robert Topala. He's been developing Geometry mostly by himself for decades, and honestly, that's one of the most impressive things about this game. He created a game that has grown into an absolutely massive community, with millions of players and thousands of creators who are now using its editor to make things that go far beyond what the game was originally meant for. But here's the problem, GD has grown like a lot. The game we have today is completely different from the game RobTop originally created, so eventually we have to ask, can one person realistically keep developing Geometry forever? Because maybe RobTop doesn't need to work harder, maybe he needs more people. And before anyone thinks I'm about to spend 20 minutes calling RobTop lazy, no, that's not what this video is about. In fact, I think developing GD mostly by himself is one of the reasons the game has such a unique identity. So today, I want to look at both sides. Why does RobTop prefer working alone? Why might bringing in a developer actually be difficult? And most importantly, will Geometry actually be better with a development team? A lot of what makes GD feels like GD comes directly from his own ideas and decisions. He has been shaping the game for more than a decade, so obviously he's going to have a very specific vision of how he wants things to work. If you're the person who's been building something for that long, giving another developer access to it isn't as simple as, hey, here's the code mate, have fun. Because now you have someone else making decisions about your game. You might have to explain why a certain mechanic needs to work a specific way, or why something that looks like a small change actually affects the way the entire game feels. And if the other developer doesn't understand what you're going for, you're going to have to spend even more time explaining it. That's probably one of the reasons working alone makes sense for RobTop. He doesn't have to compromise his ideas. He doesn't have to convince someone else that a feature is worth adding. He can just make something, test it, and decide whether he likes it. And for a game as unique as Geometry does, I can understand why that will be important. But why solo development makes sense for him? I think I completely understand why RobTop will prefer that. When you're working alone, you don't have to make a meeting schedule, explain your code, and something like that. You can just sit down, make something, and decide whether you liked it. That's probably one of the biggest advantages of being a solo developer. You have a complete authority over your creations. And for a game like GD, it matters. Because imagine if GD suddenly have 5 different developers, all trying to push the game in different directions. One wants more platform content, another wants multiplayer, another wants to complete redesign the editor, and RobTop is sitting there like,
what are you guys doing? That's obviously not ideal.
You get what I mean. However, having complete control also comes with a pretty big downside. Since RobTop is handling most of the development himself, a lot of things naturally end up depending on him, whether it's adding in a new feature, fixing something in the game, and much more. He's still only one person doing all of this. It doesn't really matter how motivated he is, because there are only so many hours in a day, and as GD continues to get bigger and more complicated, the amount of work he has to deal with keeps growing too. I think that's probably the biggest problem with the current way Geometry is being developed. It's not necessarily that RobTop isn't working hard enough, but rather that there's simply too much for one person to handle efficiently. And this becomes even more obvious when you look at what GD has become. Back in 2013, the game was pretty straightforward, but now we've got things like platformer, camera control, shaders, keyframes, advanced triggers. I know it's a lot. And an editor that has gotten absolutely insane. People are making animations, RPG style levels, and even the entire game inside GD. And the crazy part is that RobTop is still the one maintaining it, and we don't even have to speculate about what this means. We can just look at 2.2. 2.2 took years to develop, and to be fair, I understand why. Because 2.2 was a massive update that completely changed the game. RobTop had to work on a lot of certain things, but this is exactly where having multiple developers could have helped. Imagine having other developers working on their other projects, while RobTop focuses on our overall direction, instead of RobTop having to do all of those things by himself. And now we have 2.21, which is probably the funniest example of all, because 2.21 was supposed to be mostly delayed content from 2.2, and we're still waiting. And before someone says,
but that's because RobTop is lazy.
No, we don't actually know that. There could be a huge amount of work happening behind the scenes that we never see. So I don't think it's fair to assume that RobTop isn't working hard enough. We just didn't know what happens behind the scene. The bigger issues is that he's still just one person handling a massive game. The bigger question is, why does almost everything have to go through one person in the first place? Now, one thing I see brought up pretty often is that RobTop already has the GD moderators helping him. And I mean, that's true. The mods are really important for keeping the community running, handling reports, and making sure everything stays organized. But we have to remember that moderation and game development are two completely different things. The mods aren't working on the source code. So while RobTop definitely has people helping him with Jupiter does, when it comes to actually developing the game, most of that work still falls on him. And then there's the code itself. After working on the game for this long, the code can get pretty complicated, and that's where something called spaghetti code comes in.
Oh, Ren, what the hell is spaghetti code?
Basically, it's when the code gets so messy and interconnected that changing one thing can accidentally break something else. Think of it like a bunch of tangled wires. You pull one and suddenly something completely unrelated stops working. I'm not saying GD actually has spaghetti code because we don't know what RobTop's codes look like, but if a new C++ developer came in, they'd still need time to understand how everything works. RobTop already knows all of that, which is exactly why replacing or adding developers isn't as simple as it sounds. And this is where I think the argument gets interesting. Hiring developers will necessarily make GD faster right away. In fact, it could slow things down at first, because RobTop will have to get them familiar with the code and how everything works before they could really contribute. So if RobTop suddenly hired 5 developers tomorrow, I wouldn't expect 2.21 to magically come out next week. But that's only the short-term problem. In the long run, having people who already understand the project could take a huge amount of work off RobTop's shoulders. And that's where I think a development team could actually make a difference. Imagine a small team, not a giant corporation, not 50 developers, just maybe 3 or 4 experienced people. RobTop remains the lead. He still controls the vision, he still decided what gets added. But now he has people who can actually help him implement it. One developer handles the core systems, one handles the editor, one handles the networking and multiplayer, and maybe someone focuses on testing and optimizations. Suddenly, RobTop isn't doing everything. He's directing the people who are doing it, and that is a completely different workflow. And this is probably the biggest misconception about hiring a team. Having other developers doesn't mean RobTop suddenly loses control over Geometry Dash. He could still lead the project and have the final say on what gets added or changed. The developer would simply help turn his ideas into an actual features, instead of RobTop having to personally code everything himself. But there is one thing I would be worried about: Geometry Dash losing its identity. Because let's be honest, part of the reason we love this game is because it has such a specific feel to it. The physics, the way the gameplay works, and even the editor all have their own quirk that make it instantly recognizable as Geometry Dash. Just compare it to something like the Impossible game. Despite basically being the game that GD took a lot of inspiration from, they still feel completely different to play. That's the kind of identity I wouldn't want GD to lose. And if you suddenly had a huge development team making decisions about the game, I could see things becoming more polished and standardized. That's why I don't think RobTop needs a massive studio. I think he just needs a small team that understands his vision. And that's why, personally, I don't think RobTop needs 50 developers. No, I never said I wanted to turn Jupiter Dash into EA's next live service game. I think a small team of developers he actually trusts would be enough. They could help him work on the game without changing what makes GD feel like GD. RobTop still get the final say, but he doesn't have to do everything himself. And honestly, that's all I wanted. I just want Jupiter Dash to keep growing without everything depending on one person. So now we get into the question. If this sounds so obvious, why hasn't RobTop already done it? Honestly, we don't really know. Maybe he just prefers working alone. Or maybe he feels like bringing someone else into the project will create more problem than it solves. Either way, I can't really blame him. It's his game, and he gets to decide how he wants to develop it. And there's another interesting part to this. Geometry Dash doesn't really have the same business model as a lot of modern games. RobTop has a lot of freedom because there's no huge publisher constantly pushing him to release updates or add more monetizations. And honestly, that's a really good thing. For all we know, there could have been companies interested in buying Jupiter Dash for a huge amount of money, but RobTop might have to turn them down. We don't actually know if that's happened, but considering how big GD has become, I wouldn't be surprised if he's had some kind of offer at some point, and that's what makes his position pretty interesting. He gets to work on the game he wants without having some company telling him how to run it. The downside is that there's also less pressure, forcing the development process to grow with the game. So I guess that freedom is both one of the best and worst thing about having RobTop as a solo developer. So, should RobTop make a development team? Personally, yes. But I don't think GD needs a massive studio. And I definitely don't think he should stop being the person who leading the game. I think GD has simply reached a point where the workload is too large for one person to handle efficiently. RobTop has already proven that he can build incredible game by himself. But maybe the next step isn't proving that he can do everything alone. Maybe it's realizing that he doesn't have to. Because GD has grown from a simple mobile game into one of the most complicated game platforms out there. And if RobTop wants to keep building this game for another 10 years, I think having a small team behind him could make that future a lot easier. But that's just my opinion. Do you think RobTop should build a development team? Or do you think Jupiter Dash will lose something if other developers start working on it? Let me know what you think. Because honestly, this is probably one of the biggest decisions RobTop could make for the future of Geometry Dash.